I knew that I was different when I was 14 or 15, definitely in high school, but I knew or felt maybe that it wasn't safe to say anything until I had somewhere else to go, i.e., like a college campus, because I was very afraid that I was going to be kicked out of my house. And I wasn't, but I was also told that I would be eternally separated from my family in hell. And so, like, there was love there. It's like, we love you, you are our child. And also, we can't accept this because it goes against our religion. Gosh, I've done so many other podcast interviews about this part of my grief story specifically because my mom died not accepting this piece of me.
Hello, and welcome to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. This podcast is about exploring the grief that occurs at different times in our lives in which we have had major changes and transitions that literally shake us to the core and make us experience grief. I created this podcast for people to feel a little less hopeless and alone in their own grief process as they hear the stories of others who have had similar journeys. I'm Kendra Rinaldi, your host. Now, let's dive right into today's episode. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. Today, I have Shelby Forsythia. She is an author. She's written 2 books. She's written Permission to Grieve, and she also recently launched her other book, which is called Your Grief, Your Way. And she is also a fellow podcaster. She's been doing that a little bit longer than I have, for sure. And that podcast is called Coming Back. And it is about exploring all the different ways in which people come back after devastating loss, either of grief and a divorce and all other aspects of life. I'm sure we'll dive into that in a little bit. And so I'd like to welcome you, Shelby, to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Kendra. I'm really, really glad to be here today.
I am so glad you are. And by the way, everybody just like listen to her voice and you might just zone into this meditative state because it is just so soothing. I was just telling Shelby before we started recording, I was listening to her podcast as I was walking my dog yesterday and I was like, oh, it's so soothing. What is your background again?
Oh,
That
yes.
why
I was, as a kid, I was classically trained in voice and musical theater for about 12 years. And then when I
oh,
started doing grief work, I had enough people ask, hey, you should produce a podcast, or are you going to make something that we can listen to in audio? And so many people said it. I was like, maybe I should. And then I found that the training translated really, really well.
that is amazing. Well, and it definitely does. You have an amazing voice. I think I should just be quiet in this episode and just let you speak and like a lullaby. It's like a sweet lullaby. So tell us, Shelby, a little bit about you. We were talking about where you are currently living and where you're from, and then we'll dive into your grief story. So where are you at this moment?
Yes. So I actually recently relocated to Washington State from Chicago, all entirely intuitive. I think grief does this thing sometimes where it tells us what we need before we even know that we need it.
Mm,
And something that my grief has been asking of me lately is green and silence. And that's not
mhm,
something I got a lot of in Chicago. I think when I moved to Chicago, I needed to feel um, a little bit anonymous after my mom's death, which we'll get into that story. But
mhm.
also, I felt like I needed to access things pretty easily. So I'm thinking transit, grocery stores, jobs, availability. Um, and Chicago provided me a lot of what I needed, and now Washington is what I need next. And my roots actually come from North Carolina, center of the state, and the first 21 years of my life I spent there.
So you were from the East, moved to Central, now you're West. So
Yes.
tell us, where do you think, I mean, I know it's depending on what you need, like you just said, what your grief needs or your soul needs or whatever it is you need, but what have you thought of the experience of living on all the both coasts and then the central part of the United States?
I think there's gifts everywhere.
Mhm.
And that's not to say there's not inconveniences everywhere too, because there certainly are, depending on where you go. But I think they have very well almost like wine and food pairings. They've paired very well with where I needed to be in my life, or what I was looking for, or what I was trying to turn myself into in those spaces. I think for as much as we choose where we live, places also get under our skin and do something to us. So
Yes.
we transform the places we live, but then we are also transformed by the
By
places that we
them.
live. Yeah. And
I
so
agree.
in North Carolina, I think I had um, the the good grace, honestly, the luck and the privilege of being raised in a relatively solid place that had structures like voice lessons, like piano lessons,
Mhm.
like soccer practice, and like a religion or like a home church that my parents very much wanted to provide for me and my sister. And it was a very stable and sheltered and kind of Disney upbringing is
Mhm.
probably how I would label it. And then the first time to strike out on my own, to go to a city that's close to family. I have family outside of Chicago, but to be there by myself and to see what it's like to be independent in a place that has so many resources available to me, I kind of found out, okay, here's what resonates with me and here's what very much doesn't. And so it was almost like being in this divine dressing room, kind of trying on different
Mm.
articles of clothing and seeing what fit and then discarding what didn't. And I found a lot of what resonated with me and a lot of what didn't while living in Chicago. And now that I kind of have a little bit more of my um, self wisdom or identity, I'm going to use the phrase down pat, but I feel I know myself a little bit more than I did. Than when I moved to Chicago. I feel that I can come to a place now where I'm able to rest or to stand still for longer. Chicago is a place of great movement, and Washington, thus far, especially with coronavirus right now, is very much not.
Still,
And
yes.
so to be in a place that's so quiet and so green is very much the things that have always spoken to me. So the places I find inspiration for my books or the places I find healing in myself, they're able to be a little bit louder here because they're not drowned out by sirens or construction or cars or just general
Mm.
everything's open 24/7. It's very much not the case here. And so there's a different kind of community and a different kind of conversation that I'm having with myself in this place. But I think it fits exactly where I am in my life right now. If I had gone to Washington and then to Chicago, I think I would have been enormously, enormously lonely
Mm.
and felt
It was a
isolated
good
from the
step.
world. And so, yes.
Y
And
It
so
was a
to me,
good, like,
I think
in
that's true.
between. Mhm.
I still tell people I won't swear anything off indefinitely, but I don't think I'll be living anywhere in the real like south, southeast, or southwest because I just can't take the heat, and that's a personal preference. And so I
Mhm.
keep moving colder and wetter everywhere I go. And so I don't know what's next. I think if you'd asked me that question, I would have been very afraid because I literally just got here. And I don't even
Literally
know
when? When
what's
did you get
next.
there? When did you
July.
move then?
So 3 months
Oh,
ago.
literally in the middle
Yes.
of the whole pandemic you moved.
Right, right. And
Mhm.
so I am continuing to settle in. I'm still waiting for a sofa to arrive. So it's very much, you know, I have yet to actually put roots down in this place yet.
Okay. So yeah, you're still vacationing to some extent. You're still in that transition mode. It's only a 3 months that you
Mhm.
not 3 months. It's still new. Now take us back then. You were mentioning then about your childhood and upbringing then in North Carolina. So tell us then about your family unit. So it's you, your sister. Is your sister older, younger than
She's
you?
younger, 18 months though. So she and I got
Okay.
mistaken for twins quite a bit growing up, which I hated and she loved because I was the older one and she was the younger one.
Yes.
So she
Uh,
always loved to be thought of as older and I was like, get out of my get out of my space, get out of my friend group, get out of my hobbies. And it's so funny how much we followed each other growing up
Mm.
and kind of stayed in the same orbit. And now, even as adults, we are in similar spaces or fields, and yet our lives look so very different. Um,
Ah, I'm so
and so it's been
curious to
refreshing
hear.
kind of
Yeah,
growing
I'm
up
so
and being
curious to
parallel
hear.
to her.
Yeah, curious to hear how it ended up, how grief, the passing of your mom, ended up affecting each of you differently into your paths. So let's go into that. So, what year did your mom pass away, and what were the circumstances around that?
Yeah, so she died in 2013. And leading up to her death, and I won't swear on this podcast because I know we had a conversation about it before we got on the mic.
It's okay. It's
Um,
by that time I will switch. I promise I'll switch to something that I can actually make the particular episode explicit if needed. Because now
okay.
I'm
Well, I don't even know if you would mark this as explicit, but I affectionately refer to it as the 4 years of hell the 4 years leading
Mhm.
up to my mother's death. And it's not because she was being treated or actively dying during those 4 years. It was 4 years of unrelenting loss, and it was losses of
Mm.
all kinds. And this, in a way, looking back, it was kind of a blessing because now I can open my eyes to so many more kinds of loss than just death. But so the first thing that happened, it was kind of like somebody was slowly sawing the legs off from under a stool. So the first thing to go was my dad's stable job. And so our family became financially unstable. And then he was diagnosed with two identical brain aneurysms, one on either side of his head. And they were some of the largest recorded in North Carolina. And the medics at Duke Hospital were afraid for his life. And so we were as well. And shortly after that, I came out of the closet as a queer woman in North Carolina, which was both accepted and not. And so there was a lot of tension and fights about who I was and what my future was going to be in the world as a result of that. And a really tough internship where I had to prove myself as a human. It was like door to door sales, which is soul sucking to me, I've found. I developed an eating disorder. And then shortly after my dad was released from his final surgery, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer and did surgery, radiation, treatments for that for a year and a half. And as we thought we were out of the woods, like Thanksgiving of 2013, we more or less thought my mom had a cold that wouldn't go away. She was coughing a lot. She, because chemo lowers your immune system. And so we just thought she had caught a bug from being out and about or had going to church or something like that. And by the time it got bad enough to take her into a hospital, they told us that her cancer had returned and metastasized to her lungs. And anything that doctors could do at that point would buy us time, but would no longer buy us any kind of cure, any kind of guarantee for longevity of her life. And so they went in, they did a few surgeries. My mom kind of hobbled along for about a month or so. But on December 19th, they called our house, and I think my dad picked up the phone. But essentially, the news was, we've done all we can do on our end. And so you should call in hospice. And we would guess you have about 6 weeks to 6 months on the outside. And then she died in 7 days on the day after
Wow.
Christmas. And so
Wow.
after
Let me
4 years, yeah,
I'm
I know I'm
sorry. I'm
taking an
like, I need to
enormously
no,
deep
I
breath
need to
after
let
I
me
say this.
hold on.
Sorry.
Yeah. And let me process it because it's the first time I'm hearing about all the different losses as well as the circumstances of your mom's death and your dad, like all these different
Mhm.
steps. So I'm like, oh my gosh, I have a question about that. Oh, I have a question about because we could do a whole episode on each of those losses that you experienced pretty much because this episode is not like even like yours is your whole podcast as well your is not just about the grief that occurs after death but after any major transition in life, including happy ones, including moves and things like that like you've experienced. So
Mhm.
I'm just in awe. May I ask how old were you when the 4 years prior then to your mom's passing then so how old were you when your dad lost his job? I'm trying to even just perceive the age in which you experienced these losses.
So I had just turned 17, and then my mom died
Mm.
about 4 months after I turned 21. And so
Wow.
these are I was on another podcast recently, and the host referred to these years as launchpad years. You're getting ready
Hmm.
to thrust yourself into the world and declare who you are and start to take up your own space in your own world. And it's like as that rocket was launching, the thrusters were going out, and I was losing screws and bolts and side paneling, and everything was just coming apart at the seams. And it really was, I mean, once my mom died, I crash and burn. Total. I use this phrasing with clients sometimes of like, how it feels like when the rug gets pulled out from under you? It's like somebody pulled out the rug and then the floor and then the
Hmm.
foundation and then the ground and then the very center of the earth. And so there was literally at that point, after all of that loss, I really had nothing left to stand on, um, or to support me in that space. That's very much how I felt in the story that I believe to be true. I think it took a long time to create my own sources of foundation again and also see that all was not lost. But it's almost like, and we can get into this too as a separate question, but for me in my grief at least, I have to really feel the despair and the devastation of the story that everything is lost before I can get to the truth that not all is lost.
Because it's accepting a reality first to then be able to add to it. It's like everything was ripped from under you. So you're like, okay, seeing that reality that there's no carpet anymore. There's no rug there's no rug, there's no floor, there's no foundation. Okay, that's my reality. Now it was like, oh, wait, but there's a pebble right here. There is one stone that was left. And oh, wait,
Mhm.
there's actually this. It's like then you can start kind of seeing then the support or the little glimpses of gratitude in that whole emptiness to some extent as well. But that accepting that reality was the first step for you to then build on that. Now, during those 4 years, what did you use as tools, and how were you guys able to, let's say, even um, deal with your dad's diagnosis first off, and then with his uh, the loss of his job? Like, what were you guys using as a family or as individuals for support, emotional support during that time?
Hmm. Well, I can only really speak to myself because I don't know what the rest of my family was up to. And that
Mhm,
kind of points to the fact that we did not grieve together. I don't think we acknowledged it
mhm,
as a grief event, really. Um, Only now looking back do I recognize it as a loss. But I know for me, pretty much the day I got the news, I drove to the nearest mall, got Cinnabon, and went shopping. And it's funny, not funny. It's interesting to look back and see how I coped then versus how I cope now because there's still these lingering desires to escape into things that aren't
mhm,
necessarily quote unquote good for me. When I was being trained through the grief recovery method, they talked about STIRBs, short term energy relieving behaviors, and everybody usually has a top two or a top three. And in the United States, especially, food and alcohol rank really high. And then
mhm,
there's like drugs, reckless driving, fantasy, which is like Netflix or romance novels or
mhm.
things
Or
that get you out of your current
yeah, out of
reality
the
into something
reality.
else.
Mhm.
Yep. And then like shopping or
Gambling. How
gambling
about
is definitely
gambling?
one.
Mhm,
Busy work, workaholism, which is definitely something I thrust myself into as well. I think at first, I mean, if you had told me at the very beginning you're about to enter 4 years of hell, I would not have believed you. And I would have fared a lot worse because I would know that something worse is coming. But in this case, we almost kind of went ahead with our lives. Like I went off to college and then my sister followed me 2 years after because we thought at some point we would get back to some kind of normal. Like we retained this not blind optimism, but like a dogged optimism. Like
mm,
he's going to come through okay, our family's going to remain intact, like it's all going to turn out in the end somehow. And then when my mom died, I was like, it's not going to be okay. It's not going to turn out in the end. And that's when I really recognized I was like, okay, optimism is the thing that got me up to this point, but optimism can carry me no
mm,
further. You know, that I
mm.
can no longer be optimistic about this. These are no longer the wheels under my feet that are moving me in any sort of motion. Because as we kind of got through each of these separate instances, you know, my dad losing his job and then his brain surgeries, we had lovely support through the form of meal trains and carpools and family and friends dropping by the house. So we were enormously held by a community in that space. And I remember after his last surgery, we were like, oh, we don't have to do this again. And then just
Mm,
months later, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer and we were thrust into that whirlwind again. And it was like, wow, can't we catch a break? Can't we breathe
mm.
here? Um, yeah. And so I think it was like this belief in dogged optimism that was like, okay, somehow we're going to make it through this and we're just going to stick to that belief and not question it. And then for me, and this goes into the developing of the eating disorder, but food and shopping were very much how I made myself feel safe in a world that felt like it was falling apart around me.
In that moment too, because you were struggling then also with maybe deciding to come out to your family as well, right? So there was an
Mhm.
internal turmoil probably occurring as well, right? So it's like, how do you even come out during this moment of time in which everybody's kind of trying to figure out where they hold on to their life? But at the same time, had you not come out during that time, I wonder how much more drowned, like, you know what I mean? Like, how much more underwater you would have been had you not even shared that with your family.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it wasn't an easy thing to do either because I was raised in
Mm,
a very Christian home. It was non-denominational, but it was still very Christian in
mhm,
a non-accepting of gay people sense. Because I know
mhm,
there's all kinds of Christianity that exist in the world now, and I was very convinced that I would be kicked out of my house. And my coming out came pretty early in this 4-year span, and so it's like my dad lost his job and then I came out of the closet.
mhm.
Um, and I don't believe timing is foggy here because grief does a nutty thing to your
Yeah, oh,
brain.
yeah,
Timing
and
is foggy
especially
here,
when
but
you
I
have so
know
many things. Yeah, you
yes,
have so many things all at once. I can't
yeah,
even imagine keeping track of the timing and the months, and sometimes I ask that, and I've realized that when I've asked people, "So what year was that?" Or like, "Ah, you stumped me on that." Like, I don't remember, like, because it does end up becoming a little bit of a fog. So yeah, so then you're sorry, go back to what you were saying.
yeah. So it happened sometime within the first year of the 4 years of hell, but I can't tell you exactly when. I know it was around Christmas time, um, within that first year, and I had waited. I knew that I was different when I was 14 or 15, definitely in high school, but I knew or felt maybe that it wasn't safe to say anything until I had somewhere else to go, i.e.,
Mm,
like a college campus, because I was very afraid that I was going to be kicked out of my house. And I wasn't, but I was also told that I would be eternally separated from my family in hell. And so, like, there was love there. It's like, we love you, you are our child. And also, we can't accept this because it goes against our religion. And gosh, I've done so many other podcast interviews about this part of my grief story specifically because my mom died not accepting this
mm,
piece of me, and so she died
oh,
while we were in
Shelby.
the middle of a fight, essentially,
Oh,
energetically.
Shelby.
And as I've gotten older and understood more about what religion is and was to her in life, I see very much putting myself into her shoes as she was trying to save her baby's life. Like
Mhm,
she thought that I would die and die forever. And she was fighting tooth and nail the only way she knew how to save me from that, which was for me to magically no longer be queer. And I was trying to show up as a child who wanted to be fully seen by their parent. Of why
mm,
can't you love, acknowledge, accept, embrace all of who I am without needing me to be different so that you'll be happy? But neither of us had those vocabularies at the time.
mhm,
So we just yelled
right.
a lot of Bible verses at each other and talked about my fictional wedding day whenever that was going to happen somewhere in the distant future. And um, she and my dad both would throw jabs at the person that I was dating or not allow them into the house when my sister's boyfriends were very much welcome. And so it
Mhm,
felt very isolating. And then to have the losses on top of that and to try to be in college and making friends and dating for the first time and figuring out what I wanted to do with the rest of the world. This is a phrase that's been coming to me a lot, especially with coronavirus, but I'll look at my clients over Zoom and I'll say things like, this is a lot for one human to carry. And I look back at my 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 year old self and I'm like, that was a lot for one human to
it
carry.
was. I'm here, like, sitting in just absolute awe because I'm here again, I'm hearing this for the first time, and I just feel like I just wanna embrace embrace, like, just that's my empathetic self. I'm like, "Oh, I just wanna hug you right now," like, you've just it's so, so much, and what you were talking about being able to now as, the mature self you are now, view your mom's perspective now of knowing why it was that she was that it was so hard for her, and that seeing it again, having that empathy towards her too, now, um, that was also very moving when I heard that from you because it's like you're not forgetting, of course, that that was a situation that happened, but and that there's that forgiveness that comes from that love and understanding of what her point of view was, and that it was based out of her own idea of what love was. Tell me a little bit then what happened in the circumstances around when she passed away. Were you then well, no, you were home then for Christmas, or where were you in college at that time?
So I was in college home for winter break, and it was a very bizarre gift, blessing in disguise. I
Mhm,
don't even know that I
mhm.
wanna call it that, but she died while both my sister and I were able to be home, and not miss any school. It's like her I don't know how much meaning I can ascribe to this, but um it's like the cancer decided to come back at a convenient time. We had both just
Mm,
finished winter finals and were home for Christmas break. And I mean, we had been home for, I don't know, 4 or 5 days before we got the call that there was nothing more they could do. So you need to call in hospice. They called in hospice and she died 7 days later. It was like, wow, the amount of life that I lived
mm,
in one winter break. When by comparison, I knew a lot of my friends were just loafing around the house eating meatballs at their parents' houses.
mm.
Um, in comparison, I felt like I grew and aged, and frankly was traumatized so much in a 2.5 week span of time. And then it was my parents' deepest wish that I return to school, and so I went back in January for my last semester of
Wow.
college as a senior, and it was awful.
Wow. Where
Um,
was that school? Where was that school located?
in the mountains of North Carolina, and so it was
Okay,
about
so
two
it's
and a half
still
hours away,
okay.
um, from home, but it
Mm,
was still far enough away that it felt like a whole 'nother planet.
wow.
And one of my favorite and least favorite things to talk about, least favorite because it's painful, favorite because we need to talk more about it, is I was a grieving person on a college campus, and that's a thing that not a lot of college campuses are prepared to
Mm.
handle,
They
is
don't have
grieving
resources
students.
for that.
Right,
Ooh.
and so the help that I received, no offense to any grad students who are listening to this, but I was receiving counseling from grad students who were learning what it was like to counsel for the first
Mm,
time. And so I was bringing my deep pain to somebody who was in training to hold deep pain in a general way, general counseling. And I found nobody really specialized in what I needed. And so the isolation there was very strong. And then my friend group of fellow 21-year-olds, their
you
solution
couldn't
to problems
relate.
was just drink
Right.
or sleep.
Right.
Yes, and so
You can't relate.
very,
Mhm.
very hard to feel supported in that space. I felt I had very few allies on my side in that.
Now, how about with your sister? How far was she in her college from you?
She was 2 years behind me, so she was wrapping up her sophomore year when she went back, and she was down in Charlotte, North
Okay.
Carolina.
Would you guys talk on the phone? Did you guys use each other as support? Were you grieving very differently?
Hmm.
What was that dynamic like? And then your dad then being home, how did you all kind of support each other's grief separately, per se? I don't know if that makes because you each were living in a different place right after your mom's death.
Right, and so it was like we went from all of us being in the house and then all of our friends and
Mhm.
family being there, to suddenly everything becoming very quiet and
Solo.
very empty.
Mhm.
Yeah, solo living.
Mhm.
And I didn't really give that the space and honoring that it deserved at the time because I was so focused on my own grief experience. I don't think I could have done it any other way. Um, and so my dad was at home alone. I was in college alone, and my sister was in college alone. And I don't remember, this kind of goes back to the memory thing. There are whole months of time that I do not recall from that first 6 or 7 month period after her death, my final semester of college. I have flashes of being in classrooms, of interacting with professors, of graduation day, of quitting my job because I just couldn't handle having a job on top of everything else. I remember crying on one of my professor's couches in her office. Um, and I remember very few of the meals I ate and the parties that I attended. But in terms of, did I talk to my father or my sister, or how did we support each other? I don't know that we did. Something that I do remember is going home for the first time after my mom's death. So I went home in like February or March, and just walking in, and I heard my mom's voice ringing in my head of like, what
Mm.
happened? Because my father and my mother, to put it very mildly, have different organization styles. And so, to walk into the house and to not know either as a 21-year-old girl the amount of paperwork that's involved after your
Mm,
spouse dies, and to
yes.
just see everything covered by mountains and mountains of paper, and everything was everywhere, and there's absolutely no, to my mind, there was no system of organizing for the thing, um, was horrifying to me. And it really hit home that the house that I grew up in was no longer a place I could call home. The energy of my mother had gone forever. And so there was a re grieving process of acknowledging that I have lost the physical childhood home. And then too, I don't remember all the facts of this correctly either, but what led to my father being diagnosed with brain aneurysms in 2011, 2012, was him having seizures, and some of his seizures returned after my mom's death. And I think it was
Oh,
just the
wow.
sheer amount of stress that he was under. But after having just lost one parent, I was absolutely convinced that he was also going to die. And so, something that I remember my sister and I more or less banded together on was getting him to seek medical care to the point of even going to some of his appointments with him because we were so concerned that as daughters we were about to lose our second and only other parent. Um, and that's about as much of the support that I can really remember us doing. I don't know that I really connected with my family again until about a year and a half or 2 years after my mom's death because I read this book called Better Than Before by Gretchen Rubin, where she talks about how our habits can make us happier. I don't know why I was reading a happiness hack book when I was grieving, but there I was. Um, and she talked about how the number one measure of happiness in any human's life is their connections to other people. And I
Mm,
was like, well, I claim to love my family and to be connected to them, but do I ever talk to them? No, not really. And so from the time I'd read that book, I started scheduling weekly phone calls with them. And while we've kind of fallen off the map with those in coronavirus, especially because we all have different jobs and different lives now, we still check in with each other or email or send funny videos or memes or things pretty regularly. And so that feels maintained. But I think to your initial question, you were right. We all grieved very, very differently. I'm learning as I get older that my father seems to be very open and shut. And so when he is done grieving my mother, he is done grieving my mother. And
mm,
in the sense that this past Christmas, my sister and I were home and went out to our mom's favorite restaurant for her death anniversary the day after Christmas. And we assumed that my dad would be coming with us, and then he did not. And there was a lot of pain in him removing himself from our a ritual that we had been doing for the past 6 years. And he told us when we arrived home that he was done doing anything on that day to honor her memory.
mm,
Um, and that's hard. And my sister definitely leaned on God as a resource and a strength in her grief, and I definitely leaned out of God.
mm,
I
mhm,
think I was angry at God for allowing my mother to die. Um, and then there was the whole queer thing kind of wrapped up in that too. So it's like, not only are you going to
mhm,
send me to hell, but you just killed my mother. So I'm not really fond of you
mm,
right now. And I've since come to my own kind of a relationship with the thing that I believe to be God, which is very different, I think, than the God that I was raised in and under. But yeah, wow, we all grieved
mm.
extremely,
It's
extremely
so
differently.
different. So different because each of you, again, and I say this all the time, again, with you and your sister, I mean, it's your mother that died, but each of you is so unique, right? And so again, grief is unique to the person that's living it. And it's also unique to the time in our life that we are and how grief comes out may be different. So in your dad's case, 6 years later, when he was kind of done honoring your mom's death anniversary, I had never heard it that way. I had only heard it like anniversary. I had never heard
Mhm.
it as
I love the word death
death
anniversary
anniversary.
or grief
Death
anniversary.
anniversary. The grief. Okay, that day, it was kind of like where he is in his life at this moment. That is not the way he wants to continue honoring in that way, and so it can make it hard on those around. Yeah, I wanted to ask you regarding your something you said about your relationship, then like kind of developing now your new relationship with whatever we want to call the uh creative force. I don't know, what do you like to call I know what you grew up believing in terms of God, but how do you like to call that being or entity now?
Oh, interesting. I usually say universe now. It's
Okay.
almost like the thing that's bigger than God. Or if I do use God, I use the lowercase g
Okay.
instead of the
Mhm.
capital G. I'm like, it's okay. I think they're okay with the the lowercase.
Well, there's no ego. Well, yeah, because technically, if we think of it, there's still no ego. It's just like there's no ego in God. It's more us in a way of kind of like how we write it is just in a way of honoring. But
Mhm.
God could care less. We wrote it with the Lord, my own
Right.
perspective
I'm like,
as well.
God doesn't
Yeah,
care about
because there's no ego.
grammatical.
Yeah, there's no ego. Yeah. But you know what? I thought that it was really beautiful what you said, that you are now forming your own way and your own relationship. And it's kind of like, again, going back to the analogy that you gave of the rug, the floor, the foundation, you're
Mm, mhm.
building now something in which you can then stand and be like, okay, this feels like the relationship I want to have with this creative force, with the universe, with God, with whatever it is. And this feels like a good relationship. It doesn't have to be the same one that I was brought up to have, just because that was how my parents related to this creative force. I can create my own way in which feels comfortable and authentic to me. That's what it feels like you're doing in your in the process of doing, of building something new, build a new something there. Um, I don't know. Is that the case? Do you feel that that's the case?
Yes. Well, and I think the phrase that's coming to me right now is that I wanted a relationship with God that didn't have rules or criteria attached to it. Like,
Mhm,
if the thing that you are is infinite love, God, me talking to God, I'm like, if you're
mhm,
infinite love, how can you possibly put any sort of restrictions or qualifications on it, like criteria of like, this is
mm,
what gets you in the door, this is what qualifies or disqualifies you, this is XYZ. I just couldn't wrap my head around a loving universe that would require me to be different than what I am.
mm,
And so it's almost as if I was allowed to evolve from a world or a religion that insisted on structure and rules and criteria into one where the kind of God or the kind of universe that I believe in, those things don't exist. Like error
mm,
404 not found. Um, like
mm,
they don't even speak in that language.
mm.
Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I completely honor that that is the way that you have the relationship. And I think that that is one of the things, we can't just mimic necessarily the way that we've brought up being if it does not fit into what we believe. I think in the core, every individual has to be true to who they are and find their own way in which they interact with a higher being, or if they believe in a higher being. It doesn't necessarily have to be the one, the same way in which our parents or siblings or people around us relate. It has to be very, yeah, I think it has to be um, true. It just has to be true to you, to you.
Mhm.
It has to fit you. The other part I wanted to also ask you, so if you didn't have you so your mom, your sister, sorry, relied on then religion or getting close to God to then help her in her grief process. Tell us what tools you used then, because you mentioned school didn't have really that many resources. You'd go to the ones that were studying to be to be therapists or whatever, student therapists, to kind of talk to them. What was your way, aside from the eating and the other aspects that were not that healthy? What were some of the ones that were healthy in your grief process?
Yeah. I think something I allowed myself to do was be held by whoever was offering to hold me. And
Mm,
this is different from be held by the people you think should hold you. Because in the aftermath of loss, I thought my nuclear family, like my immediate family, and even some of my closest friends, like, you should be my support system right now. I very much had that expectation of who they were going to be for me. But some of my greatest supporters after my mom died, in terms of like emotional support, I can call them anytime and we'll have a conversation. I can go cry on their couch and it's fine, or I can go, you know, um, have like a Sunday afternoon chat with them and just let it all hang out, tears and rage and untrue, angsty early 20s stories all tangled up in there.
mm,
Were both of my aunts, my mom's sisters, and one of my college professors. And I
Mm.
think because they had seen such great loss before, my aunts had lost both of their parents. I mean, this is a whole other part of my grief story, but my mom lost her
Mm.
mom when she was 22. I lost my mom when
Oh,
I was
wow.
21. So she knew what she was about to
Wow.
not what she was about to do to us because she didn't cause her own death, but she knew the life that we were about to live without her. She had to get married
Mm.
without her mother. She had kids without her mother. And so my aunts also lived that life. And then they lost their father, my grandfather, when I was in fifth grade. And so they knew loss of a parent and they knew that pain. And because they also knew my mother, I could find pieces of her in them when we would talk in
Mm.
conversation. Um, and then with this professor of mine, I'd had her in a class before, and then I think she found out about my mother's death through Facebook or something, because a group of us in my major were all kind of friends together on Facebook, and and she approached me after class one day, or she called me aside, and she was like, "There is a black cloud over your head. Do you want to come talk about it?" And I was like,
Mm.
"Yeah." And I literally sat on her
You're like
couch, and she
Linus.
shut the
Is it
door, and I
Linus?
immediately. Pardon me?
Is it like who is it Linus? Who's the one that walks around like with the little which one in
Oh,
Snoopy? Is it like
oh, I think it's Pigpen, but it's because he's dirty.
Oh, okay. Oh, 'cause he's dirty. Oh, okay.
But yeah, oh, similar. I was
But the
walking around
yeah.
in something like a cloud. I did not have my feet on the ground. I was not, capable of feeling joy. The website What's Your Grief does this beautiful piece on, a condition called temporary inability to see rainbows, and I think that happens to so many people after
Mm.
loss, but that was me. I was like, anything good is impossible for me to see, and,
Mhm.
I don't think I needed to,
It's
but
like a
I the
jaded
instant.
way of seeing. Yeah, it's like a
Right.
you've kind of become a little jaded, a little dark, kind of like, "No, there aren't any rainbows." Yeah, yeah, like, yeah,
Well, and I
everything's
had
just
moved
gloom.
from jaded because jaded can imply some kind of resentment or
Mm, okay.
like a disappointed envy. I had moved from that to total hopelessness. Like I was in a place of
Okay.
despair. I was like, there are no
Oh,
other people in the world. Nothing matters. Like it wasn't necessarily that everything would be better if I wasn't here, but the only way I could see a way out was for the pain to end. And I knew that, that wasn't going to happen. And so I was just very miserable in the meantime. But she saw that in my face. And as soon as she shut the door to her office, I burst into tears on her couch. And I was like, I just can't. And she ended up being the advisor to my thesis and really a grounding force in
that's
the very
beautiful.
hardest semester of college I've ever had to take.
That gives so much hope to the education system to have those type of teachers, professors that really see their students, and she saw you, and the fact that she was able to acknowledge that and allow you to be able to express your grief. Wow. Like what a beautiful gift. Way more than anything she could have taught you probably was just allowing you to be able to express your grief. That's beautiful. Do you still have a connection with her, with this professor?
Some, yeah,
Some. Okay.
and we kind of, orbit in and out of each other's lives every now and then,
Mm.
but, I suppose, like, other things that helped me along the way, aside from, like, human support systems, I tried on a lot of things, going back to that divine dressing room of, like, try on
Mhm,
what works
mhm.
for you and discard what doesn't.
Yes.
Chicago was very much a place for that, and so I tried on a lot of different things, including Reiki, which is like a
Mhm.
Japanese healing modality where
Yes.
you pay attention to different, locations on your body.
Energies. Mhm.
Yeah, and for me, it allowed myself a way of healing where I didn't have to talk or put the experience of grief into words because I think that's a pressure that comes from traditional psychotherapy and other grief methods, even reading. I couldn't read for the first like 7 or 8 months after my mom died. I would look at
Mhm.
a paragraph and be like, I know their words and I know they have meaning, but I can't possibly knit them together and form any comprehension from them. And so to find these spaces where I could literally just pay attention to myself without needing to talk or label anything was really powerful. Um, and that helped a lot. And then eventually, when I could read again, or even when I could start listening to things, I started with podcasts about grief. And so I'm forever grateful to this platform for even existing at all. And then books came my way. I had gotten my first library card since I was a kid in Chicago, and just walked to the grief section and started checking out anything I could find. Um, and again, it was like that dressing room. I would keep the things that resonated with me, and if somebody was trying to tell me there was a certain way to do grief or something restrictive about it, or you should be over it by XYZ, that book went right back on the shelf.
Mhm, mhm.
um, so it was a
Like a
very,
candy store, yeah, you don't
yes.
have to it doesn't have to be one size fits all. There's something for everybody, and there's a tool that works for each individual, and you have to find what it is that fits you, and I love that concept of what you're saying of the dressing room kind of fitting
Mhm.
trying to fit, into something.
I'm like, "You
So
know how
the
you bring 15 pairs of pants in there and, like, one fits?" It's like that. And that's and that in and of itself is an exhausting process. So for grievers who are listening right now who feel like they're in the dressing room of their life and they're like, "Nothing fits," I'm like, "Yes, I know that struggle."
Yes,
Of like,
yes.
I take all these clothes into the dressing room and nothing fits, or it's not my style, it's too long in the back,
Mhm.
or it's torn in the front, or whatever the hell it is. It's like, yeah, and that process is also exhausting because I was literally trying to figure out who am I now in the world where my mom is dead. And so there's
Mhm.
very much not only of what am I going to do from here, it's like who am I from here? There's a rebuilding
Yes.
of identity that happens that's very hard.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's just too many layers to even count to of all the different dynamics that change, just you already mentioned the dynamics of even going into your family home, how that changed, right? The moment
Mhm.
she passed away. So there's just so many things. Now, I read a little part of the beginning of your book in which you basically why you wrote the book you just explained right now was because even in your own grief you could not find something that could even hold your attention long enough because of you could I could barely even like read a paragraph without already kind of not losing track of where I was. So tell us a little bit then about that, about all these now tools that now you have created for others and how that process came about.
Yes. Um, I was going to say to make a long story very short, but no, it's just kind of a long story. So as I started uncovering these books about grief, these podcasts about grief, all of this information that I was learning from people who had grieved before me, I started posting it on my personal Facebook. And I would have friends and family and even people I didn't know comment and be like, wow, I've never heard it this way before. Or, wow, this is really insightful. Or, wow, this is helping me talk to my neighbor or my coworker, whoever, about their grief. Like, you should do something with this. And I was like, oh, maybe I should. I didn't feel qualified in any way to be any kind of expert on grief, but um, the people around me were asking for it to be greater than I was making it. And so I started doing public Facebook Lives every Wednesday where I would just talk about some topic related to grief. I talked about pet loss. I talked about being triggered. I talked about how it's actually worth it to feel the emotions of grief. And that kind of became a regular thing. And people are like, I wish there was a way to subscribe to this. You should make a podcast. And enough people told me to do that. That I looked into making a podcast and thought about, how hard is this to do? And I think I ended up setting it up within about 2 weeks or so, but it took a while to actually figure out what I wanted to say and get it off the ground. And that has grown into um, both of my books. Permission to Grieve was the first one, and that was based on an experience I had about 2 years after my mom died, and my wallet got stolen, and I had an absolute meltdown about it. And it was the first time since the day that she died that I allowed myself to grieve. And it was over a stolen wallet, but the stories, the world is an unsafe place. Everything I love has been taken from me. I am powerless. It's helpless. It's hopeless. We're very much the same. Um, and when I had this meltdown in my room and allowed all this anger and these tears and this rage and this frustration to come out, the voice that came back to me, my own internal voice or the voice of the universe or whatever you'd like to call it, just said, you gave yourself permission to grieve. And
Mm,
so there was a very eye opening experience in that. And from that point on, I was like, okay, how can I get more of this? Because that felt good. Instead of stifling what it is to grieve, like, how can I give myself more freedom and permission to do so? And so that's the first book. And then this year in January, I was approached by Penguin Random House to write a non religious daily devotional for grief that was not woo woo or fluffy or like head in the clouds, but very practical and down to earth. And so when you flip open to any page, it's labeled for days of the year. So like January 17th or December 1st or kind of whatever resonates with you, you can follow it through the year. But whenever you flip open to any page, there's either a quote from a fellow griever, an author, a celebrity, just a grieving person in there, and a little bit of text below it, or there's some kind of practical exercise underneath it that you can actually do. So, like a guided journaling, visualization, an exercise, a practice, a script to start using with your friends about your grief, a craft project. I mean, there's all kinds of different ideas in here
mhm.
about here's where your grief can go as you're trying to figure out where it fits into your world. And there's 366 days of this. And it was such an honor to be contacted by a major publishing house to write a book about grief, because holy cow, like, for as much as humans grieve and for as much as we covertly talk about loss in documentaries and in Netflix specials and nightly news stories and politics, for as much as we talk about loss and grief, there aren't a lot of books that exist on loss and grief. Like, for as
Hmm.
much as it's part of our culture, it's not a thing that we actually write about and produce. And so to be asked to produce something in this space was really powerful. And so Your Grief Your
Wonderful.
Way is, I mean, even as the holidays are coming up, I'm like, get a copy for you and then get a copy for your friends, because you will know somebody who experiences a loss in 2021 if you don't already know
Hmm.
somebody who's experienced a loss in 2020. And then from there, from doing books, I've started working one on one with clients. I do live workshops on different topics surrounding grief, like anger or guilt or anticipatory grief, which is a big one right now.
Yes.
Um, and I'm constantly creating new things all the time. It's very much a combination of what I feel called to put out into the world, so internally generated, but then there's also what the people I am in community with ask of me. And so
Hmm.
they're like, I would really love if you could make something that felt like this or sounded like this or was this long or cost this much. And I do my very best to fit into that space. I call myself an intuitive grief guide because so much of my work is practical guidance of here's some tools, here's some frameworks, here's some vocabulary, here's some actual logistical information to sit within your grief. But the intuitive part very much speaks to, especially when I'm in a room with a client or in a workshop with people, I'm like, what needs to be said that
Hmm.
hasn't been said yet? What's the truth that we're not speaking? And maybe not because of avoidance, but maybe because we don't have words for it, or maybe because we just don't see it.
And
And
maybe we
there's
have
so
not
much
been asked the
power.
right question. Sometimes we have not
Yes.
asked that person the right. That's how I coach as well as intuitively. So the same, the
Mhm.
right question can get you to that answer of what it is you are wondering, what it is that you're still holding onto. Because
Yes.
sometimes it's not the actual grief itself of the person. If it has to do with the death of somebody, sometimes it's not that. That's the biggest even grieve that you're feeling at that moment. There could be the secondary
Mhm.
losses, too, that could have made it even worse. So, wow, that is so much. And did your first book, did you publish that one on your own? Did you do self-publish and then afterwards then what is it? Penguin Publishing House?
Mhm.
Am I saying it right? Contacted you for the second one, or how did you publish your first one?
Yes, so I self-published the first one.
That's wonderful.
And like, you asked me earlier about audiobooks, but I did audiobook for that one. I did audiobook for this one.
That's
And they're
wonderful.
all available as ebooks and stuff, and you can find them. You can find
Yay.
them wherever
Okay,
you find books.
that's what
Um,
I'm gonna do with the
but
audiobook. I love it.
But
Love
yes,
it.
forewarning for anybody who is not okay with swear language, the first two chapters of Permission to Grieve do have some swear words in there. It's me retelling the day I found out about my mother's death.
Mhm.
So grief sometimes warrants the F word, and so there's a lot of that in there. But after the first two chapters or so, it's very much about the different types of permission that we can all give ourselves in the aftermath of loss, how we can ask for permission from people who are not
Mhm.
giving us permission to grieve, like bosses, family members,
Ooh,
friends,
that's
and
important.
also how we
Mhm.
can grant permission to others without using the word permission explicitly. So it's kind of like, how can we all help each other free each other from the restrictions that we place
Mhm.
on each other surrounding grief?
Yeah, giving each other the space needed and holding space for each other in that process. It is that's wonderful. Now, what's next? What is next for Shelby? What is what is
Oh,
up? Let's see. I'm so excited to see this. This has just been a 6-year process since your mom passed away, but it's been 3 years since you've had your podcast, and it's been then what year again was it? You were 2 years later after your mom's passing is that you wrote the book?
actually, the book came much later. So the
Okay.
podcast came in 2017. The book came in 2019, and then Your Grief Your Way just came out a month ago
This
on
one.
September
Yeah.
29th. Um, so it seems to be on some kind of exponential curve. It's growing very very
Yes.
quickly. Um, well, for me, I always take off about a month between December and January. So about December 15th to January 15th, I take off just to honor the death of my mom, and my body very much remembers that season,
Mhm,
and so I
mhm.
feel I need to wind down or to sleep some more or kind of just go be quiet is the message I perpetually get in that season of my life. I will say though too, I feel um, that I'm always learning more about grief and always finding new ways to talk about the experience of grief. So a third book is already in the works. It's on its way. And this is about three teeny tiny phrases that you can use to comfort people who are grieving. So if you're a grieving
Mm,
person, you can use them on yourself, but especially for friends, family, clergy people, nurses, funeral directors, people who are adjacent to the grieving on a regular basis. These are words beyond "I'm sorry for your loss" that you
yes.
can say to people who are grieving to validate
And
them in their grief.
yeah, I have friends. You know how you say that you were saying how people would like ask you, what do I say to somebody? Or when you would post on
Mhm.
Facebook, people would say, oh, that's so helpful. Same. I get called, hey, I have this friend that died. I don't know what to do. What should I do? Like, what do I say? I'm like, okay, here's what you say. Here's what you don't say. Now, you might still put your foot in your mouth because I know I do. Even though I've experienced grief, I still sometimes say the wrong thing. And that is okay because we're humans. But that is wonderful that your book is based on these phrases that you can use to be able to comfort somebody that's going through that. Because sometimes, yeah, the words do come out all jumbled up when we're trying to express an emotion that is so deep as it is, with grief.
Yeah, it's like how do you wrap words around something that's so absolutely emotional and so
Yes.
deep? And then for people who are witnessing it as friends and family of people who are grieving, it's like, okay, now what do I say to that?
Hmm.
Because nothing I say could
Hmm.
possibly, you know, make them feel better, make them happier, all the trite things that we try to try to do to comfort people who
Hmm.
are grieving. And so these
That's
are
actually my quote. That's actually what I say. Exactly what you just said. There's nothing I could say right now that could ease your pain. That's one of that. But I just want you to know I'm thinking of you. That is one of the phrases that comes out naturally because it's exactly what you just said. There is no words right now that I could say that could bring any comfort. I know. I know that
Mhm.
there's nothing that the right words right now. So wow. Okay, sorry. I keep on interrupting. I'm just so I go ahead. Continue.
It's a very exciting idea to talk about because I think
Yes.
it's a pain point that a lot of people have. Even so, I'm writing the introduction for the book right now, but even I, as a grieving person and a person who works with grievers, struggle with what to say. And so
Yeah.
it's like, it's not a problem because you haven't grieved. It's a problem because it's like words fail in the face of something so great. And so the book lists three different phrases to say to comfort the grieving, kind of based on where they are in their grief and what they're showing to you to be true. And then I have about eight more books that are in me, I think for sure, and then
Oh
possibly
my
more after that.
goodness.
But
Shelby, this is okay. Now you're a you studied musical theater. So this whole like storytelling aspect in you, this is kind of how it's being birthed. Or what? Or have you always liked to write? Did you ever write any books before
oh,
these, like in terms of storytelling and so forth at school?
well, and I say I studied musical theater, but that was the lessons that I took when I wasn't in school, and so it wasn't the
Yes.
thing I studied at a collegiate level. So I
Oh,
studied
okay, okay, okay.
copywriting in the advertising industry.
Oh,
My plan was to
that
work in the
okay.
corner
Look
office
at
for
there
Leo
we go.
Burnett. But
Here we
and again,
go.
no learning is ever wasted. But I
Amazing.
wanted to be a writer since I was 5 years old, and I would write these stories about Happy Meal toys that I'd get from McDonald's. And I remember drawing
Cute.
little pictures. I wanted to be a writer and an illustrator, and so I had these little pictures that would go along with. And I tried to write a fantasy story in middle school, and then my mom made fun of me.
Oh,
And then
man.
my friends made fun of me, and I was like, "Oh, that kinda killed off that dream." And
Mm,
in the aftermath of my mom's death, I started writing as a way to cope, to get emotions out of my body, even if words were imperfect. They kind of captured it in some way and
mhm.
locked them onto paper so I don't have to carry them around anymore. And
Yes,
then as I started interviewing people for my podcast and doing this work as a speaker in this space and working with people one on one, they're like, you have words for this or frameworks for this or even metaphors like the dressing room for this that I have never
yes.
heard before. You take the large abstract experience of grief and put legs on it, and that
Mhm,
helps. And so it becomes and continues to be a space where I feel very much called to show up is writing. That being said, I'm always open to where creativity wants to take me next.
mhm.
Uh, I have a
Just like
lot
your
of ideas.
travels. Just
Yes.
like your travels.
Yeah, I don't have you noticed I don't really like to pin myself down very
Yes.
much?
And, you're flowing like the feather that's just kind of just going with the wind and just kind of seeing where it's gonna rest upon next, but a feather will never stay still, right? It will still be able to just again, wind comes through, it will pick up again and fly. So you're just going with it, your creativity as well as where you are physically. But I think that that is very important actually for a creative person to change the environment they're in physically. Personally, sorry, I feel that changing your environment physically does end up being able to spark a different energy, different ideas because your interactions are changing. So your flow of energy is different and more creative in that way than when you're stagnant. Um, so I would say that easily you could probably still switch. If you have 8 books in you, I could foresee a few more cities in your future.
Coming to a city near you.
Yeah, just, to see where else and maybe, the type of energy that that particular environment gives you is reflected in the type of book you write, because it will end up kind of infiltrating its way in there too. So
Oh, I
that
like that
is
idea.
you know what I mean? Like
Yes.
what you would have written in Chicago is very different than what you're going to write out in the mountains and green places. This is coming from a theater person here, like that, or another artistic viewpoint here. And I could be totally wrong. I have never written a book, but I could just see it being very different. The energy that is in you. Depending on the environment you're in, and so therefore your book is going to be a reflection of that. So I don't know. I may be wrong, but but
Oh,
there's
yes.
something
Well, I
in
mean, I
that.
look at my first book, Permission to Grieve, which I wrote in 2019, and then, or 2018 to 2019, and then Your Grief, Your Way, I actually wrote it in the first 2 months of the pandemic
Mm,
here between March and May of 2020. And so the tone and the desire I have, like the message I'm trying to get across, it's still
mhm,
freeing yourself from the restrictions you have surrounding grief, giving yourself permission to grieve, but the messaging and the words that I'm using in there, vastly different. Sometimes I
mm,
look at the two books, I'm like, I know I wrote both of these, but it's very interesting to see how they're evolving both with time, with location, with my maturity as a grieving person,
yes, because we're
but then
growing.
also with
Yeah.
what's happening globally. So yeah, fascinating to
Yeah,
see.
no, that's going to be interesting to read. You're going to when you compare, book number 8 to book number 1, you're going to see all your growth. And I know you say grief growers to your podcast listeners, and that is what you're doing yourself. You're constantly growing and changing, and every individual in our life, whether it's from grief or any other aspect in our life, we're constantly growing and evolving. If not, I don't know what else would be the purpose of living were we not growing in the process. And all these tests, as we have witnessed here in your life, have definitely been catalysts for a lot of growth and therefore also a lot of giving back in that growth process now with all these platforms that you have and what you're doing. So thank you.
Yes, and thank you too. I think there's this myth that growth needs to be visible and growth needs to be good. But
Mm,
sometimes growth is just getting more information about yourself or having lived more life, and sometimes it happens very slowly. And the
mm-hmm.
reason I call my community grief growers, and the reason why my tagline is because even through grief we are growing, it's because I wish that someone had told me in the aftermath of my mom's death that I wasn't stuck, I wasn't going backwards, that even in the aftermath of her loss, when I felt like I was standing still and the rest of the world was plowing ahead, that I was learning what it meant to grieve, and I was learning who I was as a grieving person. I was learning what was healing to me, and I was learning what was hurtful to me. And all of that became the building blocks on which I am now standing. And so, even in this place when I was absolutely convinced that growth was impossible or even going backwards, there was growth happening. And so,
Yes.
even through grief, we are growing. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you. Is there anything else that you'd like to share? If you can definitely share your websites and stuff, but is there anything else regarding grief that I did not ask that you'd like to share?
I think this was perfect.
Good. Thank you. So if you want to say just quickly like your website, and I'll definitely put it in the show notes.
Oh, sure. Yes, you can find the podcast, books, live workshops, work with me one on one. Everything lives at shelbyforsythia.com.
Perfect. And they can find your links to also how to find you on Instagram and Facebook on that website as well.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Everything lives
Can you
there.
spell your last? So Forsythia, F-O? Yes, just spell your last name too, because it's the first time I see your last name, by the way.
Sure. It's actually a flower that's native to North Carolina, which is why I
Oh,
use it as my business name. My given name is Forsyth. I added the IA both as an homage to my home state and also because I was a florist for a little bit. So
beautiful.
it's a fun
Play on words.
play on words. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
So Shelby, Shelb as in boy, Y, Forsythia, Fors as in Sam, Ythia. And so, like John Forsyth, take off the E and then add an IA at the
I
end, and you'll get pretty
Perfect.
close to it. Yep.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Thank you so much again for your time and for all the beautiful I call them nuggets. I have not found nuggets tips. I have to find another word so I don't sound so repetitive saying nuggets of learning and, and so forth. I'll have to find. Do you have another synonym for nuggets or
Let's
tips?
see. I usually say pieces of wisdom. Um,
Ooh, I like that. Pieces of wisdom. That's a good one, but I can't steal that one. But I'll find. But yeah, it's those little learning tips that you gave us. So thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Kendra.
Thank you again so much for choosing to listen today. I hope that you can take away a few nuggets from today's episode that can bring you comfort in your times of grief. If so, it would mean so much to me if you would rate and comment on this episode. And if you feel inspired in some way to share it with someone who may need to hear this, please do so. Also, if you or someone you know has a story of grief and gratitude that should be shared so that others can be inspired as well, please reach out to me. And thanks once again for tuning in to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. Have a beautiful day.